This is John Brzenk, the greatest arm wrestler of all time, and this is his story. What is greatness? Or in the modern sense of the question, what makes someone the GOAT? Is it wins, achievements, dominance, longevity, or is it something more? Humans have always been obsessed with greatness. In every culture, in every time, we have marveled at incredible feats. Who can run the fastest, throw the farthest, lift the heaviest weight? But with the complexities of modern sports, the conversation of who is the greatest garners endless debate. In many cases, we find ourselves debating amongst fans of a sport about who is really the greatest. Cristiano Ronaldo versus Lionel Messi, Jordan versus LeBron. These debates are made endlessly more complicated by the intricacies of team sports, where one could argue that the support a particular athlete receives makes others' achievements more or less impressive. Which is why I would argue debates about who is the GOAT are far more interesting among individual sports. And even among individual sports, there remains much debate, as there are different ways one can measure greatness. Some are the most dominant for a short while others are consistently good for longer than anyone else. Combat sports have generally been one sport where dominance is somewhat more easily determined. If one combatant beats another, it is generally the case that they are the superior athlete, with perhaps a few exceptions that one could debate. The agonies of Theos is an ancient picture of legendary greatness, in a combat sport with a legacy that is still impressive today. The agonies was a Greek boxer who is rumored to have won about 1,300 bouts over the course of a 22-year career. His most significant achievement came at the Olympics in 480 and 476 BC, when he became the first athlete to win a wreath in two events, boxing and pakraton. He would go on to win another 21 championships. The Agonies remained undefeated as a boxer for over 2 decades. A historical fingerprint like this can most accurately be depicted by another one of his historical legends. The story goes, when a vandal attempted to deface a statue honoring the Agonies, the giant bronze carving fell on the man and crushed him to death. It is this picture of leaving a legacy so monumental that those who attempt to topple it are ultimately crushed in their pursuits. There is another combat sport that has also had quite the historic legacy dating back to ancient Egypt, or perhaps even farther. Arm wrestling is a sport that does not have notoriety today as boxing or wrestling does. However, it requires just as much skill, technique, training as other combat sports. While many people think arm wrestling is as simple as pushing another person to the table in a show of strength, in reality, arm wrestlers use physical techniques throughout their whole body. Arm wrestling also contains one of the most interesting and indisputable claims to greatness in any sport. There is one man who stands above the rest, and that man is John Brzenk. John Brzenk is the GOAT of arm wrestling, and there is a very rare case that there is in effect no debate among the sport about this fact. While other arm wrestlers today are bigger, faster, and stronger, this rather unassuming looking and mild-mannered airplane mechanic is and will always be considered the GOAT. And how is it that he became so great, that he achieved such a monumental feat that no one will ever come close to matching it? How is it that even when he suffered a recent loss at almost 60, he received a standing ovation that everyone remembered arguably more than the victory of the person who just beat you? To answer this question, we have to go back to the beginning. John was born July 15, 1964, in McHenry, Illinois. John Brzenk's father, John Brzenk Sr., was also an arm wrestler, and as perhaps some of us has done, John started his amateur arm wrestling career in the classroom, where he arm wrestled his peers across tables for 5 years. However, when he was in the 8th grade, he broke his arm while arm wrestling his father's friend. This, thankfully, was not the end of John's career. He has said later on that this arm break increased his tendon strength significantly. And while having stronger tendons and an arm wrestler father who is a good teacher certainly helped John, I would argue there's nothing that can truly explain the incredible and nearly indescribable nature of his accomplishments to come. After his childhood arm break, and early years of pulling in the classroom, in 1980, at the age of 16, John started to take the sport more seriously, and one might think that with a good teacher and many years of practice, a person that starts young might be able to accomplish something great in the sport. However, when you're the GOAT of something, your greatness can be more quickly apparent. For John, it only took 2 years to show the world the first glimpse of how good he was. It also brings us to the first decade of John's career. To begin this part of John's story, in the 80s, we find ourselves in Woodstock, Illinois, May 17, 1982, where at the IWC National Championships, John competes and wins second right-handed in the lightweight division. While this is definitely impressive, his performance that would take place in September just 4 months later is perhaps a more notable starting place. It seems worth noting where John was just 4 months before as we now look at his first notable winning performance. We now find ourselves at the 1982 IWC North American Championship on September 11th in Dundee, Illinois. John Brzenk Sr. placed first in the men's middleweight, left and right hand, where John Brzenk Jr. was nowhere to be seen. While I could not find any proof of this, it seems likely that John did not compete in this weight class that his father did. His father's love, skill, and training in the sport had brought John to this point. In this tournament, John had entered the lightweight and heavyweight right-hand classes, and this is the first impressive part of this story. The reason this is interesting is because of how arm wrestling tournaments and weight classes work. You see, there are different weight classes, and then there are right and left-handed brackets for each class. In this case, there were 3 classes, though most later tournaments would adopt a different weight class system with more classes. In this case, John, being in the lightest class, meant his weight could not exceed the limit for that division, but he could enter any class he wanted to above that. So this is the first impressive fact of this particular story, when John was pulling men 2 weight classes above him, which, if you're familiar with combat sports, is generally unheard of. With more weight comes things like more muscle, more height, and while John stands at 6'1", there were definitely bigger men in these other classes. The second thing that was incredibly impressive is the fact that he was in 2 classes at all. John would have to pull twice as many people. It's hard to compare this feat to any other sport due to the unique elements of arm wrestling. But imagine a combat sport in a bracket-style tournament. If someone won a lighter weight division, it would undoubtedly be impressive. However, if you heard this same combatant also entered another bracket on the same day with just as many combatants, but it was 2 weight classes higher, you might think he probably wouldn't be left standing for very long. Now, with all this in mind, it's easy to forget John was only 18, and he had only been seriously training for 2 years, and only 4 months ago had placed second in just the lightweight division. Now, with all this stacked against John, one would think this seems an impossible task. Even placing at all would be impressive. But when you are to become the GOAT, everything is just a warm-up for the years to come. So at 18, John absolutely smokes the competition and finds himself a 2-division champ. And there is no one else in professional combat sports that can really compare to this feat. Sure, there are 2-division champs, and there are those who did it young. And there are even those who became champions in a short amount of time. But I would argue there is no one who has done them all in such a dominant fashion like this. And perhaps the only thing that kept John from being an undisputed 3-division champ is his father. And it was at this moment the two shared this honor together. John is later quoted in his life in an interview saying, quote, "The early days for me was all about proving something to my dad. You know, I looked up to Dad and saw what he is doing and wanted to be better than him. But this was only the beginning." If John had stopped here, this story would likely not look the same as other arm wrestlers would come along and have done more impressive things. And at this point, John was not the GOAT, but he was at the cusp of being the best in the world. By 1982, John was already turning heads after winning major titles. He had just won those 2 classes at the IWC North American Championships, and shortly later in September defeated top puller Harley Manyard and had won his first title in Kinchester, Ontario. But the question still remained. What of the other dominant arm wrestlers of the 80s? Did John have what it take to beat them? You see, there were 2 big things that stood in his way of truly being the undisputed best in the world in the 80s. These 2 things were Johnny Walker and the seriously big Cleve Dean. Cleve Dean, a giant, stood at 6'7", 460 pounds. He was a giant in more ways than one. He was one of the best to ever pull. Cleve Dean was a hog farmer from Pavo, Georgia, and was the best arm wrestler as soon as he started competing. He took second in his first tournament in December 1977, after which he decided to train for the sport for a few months. He then became virtually unbeatable. Cleve would go on to dominate the rest of the 70s, and with winning his first world title in 1978, he came into the 80s being one of the top men to beat. However, between 1980 and 1986, Cleve took a break from the sport due to his failing health, which would be an issue for him for much of his life. He won at least 20 national championships or world titles from all the top organizations of the area. John would later get wins against Cleve, but sadly due to poor health in the 80s, the titan of the sport did not remain on the top of the sport as he had in the 70s. This would only leave one real challenge for John Brzenk to clinch without question his title as best arm wrestler in the world for the 1980s. Johnny Iceman Walker was another legendary Georgian arm wrestler, and arguably edged out Cleve Dean as a more formidable opponent in the 1980s. Johnny Walker was known for strapping 20-pound sandbags around his wrists and wearing them all day at work for training. There are also stories of him tossing a 100-pound dumbbell from one hand to the other, and he had an incredible style on the table. They called him Iceman due to how he would step up to the table. He would put his elbow down and stare calmly with a blank expression. And when his hit would come, most matches didn't even last 2 seconds. Walker had an impressive WPAA world title streak going from 1977 until 1985. By the end of the decade, he had added at least 30 national world titles. Walker was also one of the only arm wrestlers that would give John a run for his money at the time. Of course, when you're the GOAT, nothing remains much of a challenge for very long. John solidified his position as the best puller in the world in a Reno tournament in the early 1984. There, he defeats Johnny Walker at just 19 years of age, about 1 year after his 2 title wins in his first world championship. He defeats the top middleweight puller in the world. This put John on top of the arm wrestling world, and it was with this momentum John continued his dominance and brings us to our next stop in this journey. We now find ourselves in 1986 in the over-the-top tournament. As we look at this tournament, we must also look at the film bearing the namesake of the tournament, starring Sylvester Stallone, that came out the next year in 1987. This movie was, and still is to some extent, big for arm wrestling, and many arm wrestlers point to it as their inspiration for starting in the sport. Most people familiar with the movie knew very little or even nothing about the actual tournament that it was based off of. The movie and the tournament were effectively made together. Almost all of the footage in the film is from the actual tournament. The only exceptions were the shots that featured Stallone himself. Stallone's on-screen matches were actually all filmed the day after the real finals, and it had been said that the character of Hawk was loosely based off of John. The tournament itself is a thing of legend. Over the Top was the biggest event in arm wrestling history, beginning with the first qualifier in Beverly Hills in August 1985. The competition lasted a year, moved the length and breadth of North America, and included qualifying events in Europe and Israel. 4 best arm wrestlers in each contest qualified for the finals in Las Vegas. Although an arm wrestler could enter as many of these qualifying events as he or she could go to, they could only qualify once. John competed in the truckers division because he worked for Delta Airlines. It is also because of this he was able to travel to multiple qualifying events and took full advantage of this ability and went to many of them. Once the qualifiers came to an end on the 26th of July, 1986, over 800 arm wrestlers had qualified for Over the Top tournament, and they found themselves in Las Vegas to compete in the finals. With such a large number of competitors, it was impossible to run the tournament on 2 or 3 tables. In fact, between 8 or 10 tables were actually used throughout the tournament. The tournament started at 1 p.m. and ended the next morning. 2 broken arms, and about 18 hours later, sometime between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m., the tournament finally concluded. There are numerous interesting stories that could come out of this legendary tournament. One thing is for sure though, after 18 hours, one man stood atop the rest, and it was perhaps the only time during the whole tournament where everything seemed to stand still. John Brzenk faced off against Ed Arnold, and when the dust settled, John had won the tournament truckers division. and had won a $250,000 Volvo white truck and a brief cameo in the movie. And it was at this moment everyone understood they were in the presence of greatness. John closed out the 80s on top of the arm wrestling world. There is something special about arm wrestling, a unique appeal that is in some way universal. Everyone can find something appealing about watching skill and strength clash in a medium that we all understand. Two hands clasp in combat, and in the end, one hand topples the other. However, arm wrestling is unique in those whom it calls to. It has long been an underground sport. Even when it finds its way into the spotlight, it is often misunderstood. However, for those who hear the primal call of the sport, they often never leave. Arm wrestling has the benefit of being very physical while still allowing competitors to stay healthy and compete for years or even decades. John was young and healthy and came into the 90s a man on fire. It is safe to say the sport of arm wrestling had found its man to sit on the throne. Perhaps John needed arm wrestling as much as arm wrestling needed John, because what he would do over this decade and the next few decades to come were absolutely unbelievable. It's hard to even conceive of this multiple decades of dominance. Even considering one decade of dominance is impressive. Many athletes in the world can only claim a high level of dominance for a few years at the most. In most sports, dominance over a decade can easily put you in the conversation to be the greatest. When it comes to dominance, wins, and longevity, John has done it all. In fact, it's almost impossible to list all of his accomplishments. There are several feats from John that are well documented, and this next feat is arguably one of his most impressive. From 1982 to 2015, John only suffered a single supermatch loss in 2004. And only a handful of people have beaten him in tournaments. Most of these losses occurred later during that time when he was advanced in age. That is 22 years being undefeated in supermatch format. On top of winning almost every single tournament he entered in multiple weight classes in both hands, which means he was often winning 6 classes. To say this is impressive is an understatement. Quite frankly, it's incomprehensible. There is absolutely no comparison in modern arm wrestling, or any sport for that matter. There is no air atop the mountain which John sits on. No one has climbed it since, and no one ever will. Undefeated streaks in arm wrestling are not unheard of, but most are a few years of winning a particular title, or a supermatch win streak that is much different considering modern arm wrestlers train specifically for supermatches and only have a select few a year. Some old-school arm wrestling fans who understand the wear and tear of the constant competition can truly appreciate how beyond belief it was that John was undefeated and was still dominant in tournaments. Often John would be at 2 tournaments a month and compete several months in a row, often not taking off more than a few months at a time. Perhaps one way to look at John's tear in the 90s was with his friendly rivalry with the legend Ron Bath, another Georgia arm wrestler. Ron Bath started making waves in the sport in the late 80s, but it is during the 90s that he truly became one of the sport's superstars. During the decade, he won at least 18 national world titles, a mix of AAA sit-down, AAA stand-up, USAA, USAF, AWI, and WAF. 1997 to 1999 were particularly good years for him. He won 20-plus major titles, including left and right titles at the main event in 1997, the biggest pro tournament of that year, and at the Forza Tropical International in 1998, the biggest pro tournament of that year. Ron Bath still competes at a high level in his 60s and has an incredible legacy that should put him in the top 10 of any arm wrestling list. And that is perhaps what makes this comparison so impressive. As great as Ron was in the 90s and still is even to this day, having competed for over 40 years, it shows how incredible John was during this time and still is today. Ron arguably had his most impressive run during the 90s, but still took second place to John. Even John's own brother was stuck in his shadow, even with an impressive resume in the 90s. Some even don't know about Bill Brzenk and how good he was during the 90s. For a couple of years around the middle part of the decade, in the world of arm wrestling at the 200 pounds, there was John Brzenk followed by Bill Brzenk, followed by everyone else. In addition to a handful of national titles, he won world titles with the WPAA, AWI, and the WAF. He also won a Gold Bear title and pro titles at both main events. John simply beat everyone and won everything. He won the Golden Bear title in Russia in 1990, 1994, and 1998, which were considered the toughest tournaments in the world at that time. Chapter 3. The Challengers. John had come into the aughts the greatest arm wrestler for 2 decades. In fact, John was so dominant for so long that in the year 2000, the Guinness Book of World Records acknowledged him as the greatest of all time. But this decade was a turning point for John. By his own admission, he had been considering retiring from the sport due to getting older. He was still winning absolutely everything he entered. For example, one interesting feat that he completed on April 12, 2003 was called the John Brzenk Challenge. It was held in conjunction with the California State Pro Arm Wrestling Championship, hosted by John Burgesson Sr. and his team, with a chance to win a cash prize. In this challenge, John beat 102 pullers with his right arm alone in a row, many of whom were top-level pullers who had bid on spots for the chance to be the one to pin him. Not even this was a challenge for John. It was at this point in John's career, it was as if even his incredible accomplishments just became another trophy on his proverbial shelf. And everything he did was so impressive to the mere mortals who entered his domain. In 2009, a documentary film based on his arm wrestling life and career was released. John remained dominant and was undefeated in the world of arm wrestling. He even defeated much bigger and stronger opponents. The film shows the championship in Warsaw, where determined competitors such as Travis Brzenk tried to defeat John. While Travis was incredible in the aughts and played a big role in the film, there was another who stood as the true test of John's ability. The film culminates with a match between John and Alexei Vovoda. Alexei Vovoda was on a roll with his right arm in the early 2000s. By 2003, he had won Zloty titles 3 years in a row, including 2 in the overall division. In many people's eyes, he had proven himself to have the strongest right arm in Europe, and it was just a matter of time before he would prove that it was the strongest in the world. His streak was interrupted at the WAF World Championships in late 2003, where Travis Brzenk beat him in convincing fashion. Undeterred, he trained intensely over the next year and then would win the overall division. Alexei Vovoda in 2004 was John's first professional loss in 22 years. Shortly after this, Vovoda would retire from the sport to become an Olympic bobsledder. It's as if Vovoda got closer than anyone else had in a long time to breathing the same air as John. Beating the best is one thing, being the best is something different. Later in life, John, always being very humble, was asked about the pressure of being the greatest and the pressure of losing, and he said, "I never really thought about the possibility of losing. It wasn't that important at the time." John never made excuses for losing, even to some of the absolutely enormous and juiced-out monsters he would face in his career. And as I mentioned that, there's 2 other facts about John I've kept hidden. The first is that he famously never cared much for lifting weights. He occasionally used weights for recovery, but John believed in arm wrestling hard about once or twice a week. To the modern athlete, this seems crazy. How could you be as great as he was with only a few hours of training a week? What was his secret? Well, there wasn't a secret. The second fact about John is that he didn't do steroids. Well, he didn't do them until he was in his early 40s, and even then he did them just to keep healthy. Somewhere around 2005 or 2006, John started taking testosterone to supplement his health as he got older. Thinking back, how incredible is John's legacy, knowing the way he trained and that he did not use PEDs in an untested sport. John Brzenk has said, quote, "You can be champion without steroids. I did it for 20 years." John would face off against many incredible opponents in the aughts. For example, his match against Devin Lair in 2008, which was one of the few losses John had this decade. John Brzenk was the top puller in the 1980s, the top puller in the 1990s, and at the end of this decade, he was also the top puller of the 2000s. During this period, from 2000 to 2009, John racked up more than 200 major titles in virtually all of the professional organizations. He won a record 11 Zloty titles, including the overall right-handed division 4 times. He competed in 7 PLA Vendetta arm fights over the course of the decade and won all of them, including a 2009 match with Denis Saplenkov. While he did experience some losses during this decade, he managed to hold the overall #1 right-hand ranking on the planet for 7 of the 10 years. Even as John slowed down, he was still incredible. And it should be noted that by slowing down, he was simply slightly less dominant in the super heavyweight class, which contained many bigger arm wrestlers. The next decade proved to be more of a challenge for John, as the one thing that could slow him down began to creep up on him. Chapter 4. The Tens. Hurting from the thing you love. John Brzenk had been recognized as the top puller for the past 3 decades, though the tens would prove to be something a little different for John. He would find himself unofficially retiring from the sport in 2015. His accomplishments during the middle part of the decade certainly earned him a spot in the top arm wrestlers of the 2010s. He won multiple classes at the UAL's biggest tournaments, as well as the Mike Gold Classic. He won every right-handed class he entered at the WA's largest event, and he made it to the podium in the A1 Russian Open in the right-hand absolute division twice in 2014-2015, only finishing behind the much heavier Andrei Pushkar and Denis Saplenkov. With wins over Michael Todd, Devin Larratt, Dave Chafee within the span of less than 12 months, he showed the world why he's the greatest of all time. Ukraine's Andrei Pushkar is an interesting case study from the tens. He basically won everything there was to win at some point, or many times during the 2010 with both arms. His list of accolades is simply astounding. During the decade, he enjoyed supermatch victories over pullers that included Tim Brenshaw, Richard Lupus, Dmitry Trubin, and Michael Todd. But it is in his tournaments where he stood out the most. He won Senior Division EAF European titles in the Super Heavyweight division with both arms in 2011, 2012, and 2013. He accomplished the equivalent feat in the WAF World Championships in 2010, 2011, 2012 before retiring from the amateur side of the sport in 2013. 2012 was actually the 5th year in a row that he had accomplished this feat at the WAF World Championships. In 2011, he won the left-handed absolute division at the Nemiroff World Cup ahead of Denis Saplenkov and Travis Bagent to claim the world's #1 ranking. At the 2012 edition, he won the super heavyweight and the absolute division with both arms. He did this once again at the 2015 tournament. In all, he won 12 Zloty titles during the decade, of which 8 were in the absolute division, more than any other competitor. He won the absolute right arm division at the 2018 Moldova Open, at least 2 absolute division titles at Los Shinto, and 3 A1 Russian Open absolute titles. His right arm defeat of Denis Saplenkov at the 2014 event, earning him the world #1 ranking with that arm. He successfully defended that ranking for more than 4 years, until his untimely death in a car accident Wednesday, 14th November 2018. While he didn't win everything he entered, his accomplishments throughout the decade with both arms makes him the top puller of the 2010s. Pushkar showed flashes of incredible greatness. It is truly sad that so much potential was cut down so young in his prime. John's winning would slow down more than it had at any point before. John had considered retiring in the aughts, and now his shoulder would seem to be his undoing, and John would officially retire in 2015. It would seem as if the thing that John loved for so many years was causing him pain. John's shoulder had grown as an issue, and is what ultimately caused him to unofficially retire. Those who love the sport of arm wrestling know there is something magical about watching mastery of the sport, just as people appreciate the greatest painters, athletes, or singers. When John pulled, there was something electric, and I would argue that as he aged, or even as he slowed down, the magic grew every time he competed. Everyone wanted John to win. We all wanted to see those flickers of light sparkle off the king's crown once more. We all hoped beyond hope that he would one day grace the table once again and reclaim his throne. If it was anyone else, in any other sport, and any other injury, being in one's mid to late 50s, would have been the end, even long before it got to this point. However, when it comes to arm wrestling, it seems that no one can resist the pull of the table. On January 11, 2019, the NAL qualifier in Phoenix, Arizona, John would stretch his wings for a dominant right-handed supermatch over Derek Smith. This match would close out the decades, and while John was not the top puller, there was something all arm wrestling fans wanted to see. We all wanted to see the GOAT, now getting close to 60, have one last ride. This is the draw of arm wrestling, the quiet call that few hear. We are drawn, the beauty of greatness displayed in strength, as two titans clashed in combat. History that becomes legacy. Chapter 5. Legacy in the Age of Giants. Legacy is written over a lifetime, but what is legacy in the Age of Giants? From 2020 onward, we find the most discussion among arm wrestlers, particularly those online, of those who want to claim that there are others who are threats to John's status as the GOAT. They cite modern achievements and look at such a small sample size, as if 42 years of being the GOAT was not enough. To be fair to this critique, John has effectively retired at this point. Aside from this one supermatch in 2019, the arm wrestling world was holding their breath, hoping to see John return. But if he did, would it be the same? Perhaps it was good that John retired, for surely he could not reclaim his former dominance. And perhaps, if this was anyone else, in any other time in any other sport, you would be right. No matter how much one loves a sport, history is filled with few great comeback stories of athletes nearing their 60s. But if you have been following this story, perhaps you might finally begin to realize that this is no ordinary man. This is John Brzenk, who stands as a monolith to all who wish to call themselves the greatest in any sport. We find ourselves, it's July 17th, 2021, Rumble at the Rainbow 2 in Roy, Utah. The weather was fair, and John handily defeats the competition in the right 206 to 232 and the right 232 plus classes. This was seemingly just a warm-up, as John was about to do the incredible once more. On July 31st, 2021, John Brzenk would return to arm wrestling full-time by defeating Chance Shaw in a super match 3-1. Chance Shaw is no slouch and is a formidable young arm wrestler who, at the time of filming, is the 14th ranked super heavyweight in the nation according to the U.S. arm wrestling rankings. This match is truly incredible. To watch the joy, the thrill, the struggle, the excitement of the crowd. And this excitement would continue. On December March in 2022, in Oda, Norway, he wins a right-handed supermatch 3-0 over Engen Terzi. April 30th, 2022, Kentucky Muscle International Arm Wrestling Championships in Louisville, Kentucky. He wins a right-handed supermatch 3-0 over Pablo Dungarbayev. April 30th, 2022, Kentucky Muscle International Arm Wrestling Championships in Louisville, Kentucky. John would go to win another right-handed supermatch 3-0. On May 21st at East vs. West 3, Brzenk would go on to have a match against Zurab. John would go on to win this match by a score of 3-2. It is safe to say that John was on a tear. However, in John's age, he had begun to come down off the insurmountable mountaintop from which he once sat. The match from this time period that stands out the most to me in particular was July 9th, 2022, Monster Factory 2, Hot Springs, Arkansas. This was a right-handed supermatch where John faced off against Corey West, who at the time of this video is the 4th ranked super heavyweight in the nation. It's hard to say why this match stands out so much to me personally. Perhaps it's Corey's size, weighing north of 400 pounds and standing at 6'3". Perhaps it's the fact that some people argued that he is the only person big enough to stand a chance on the international stage for the dominance that the East is producing. Perhaps it's how close the match was. Or perhaps it's always just been fun to watch David kill Goliath. And in this case, to see John live up to one of his many nicknames, the Giant Killer. John wins 3-2 over Corey West. On August 6th, 2022, at East vs. West 4, John Brzenk was defeated in a right-handed supermatch with Ketergali Ungarbayev, who is an absolute phenom in his own right, with a win over Michael Todd at East vs. West. On November 19th of the same year, in the next installment of East vs. West, Brzenk would go on to defeat Olev Petruchenko in a right-handed supermatch in dominant fashion. He would win this match 3-0. On July 21, 2023, John Brzenk would participate in the 5th consecutive installment of East vs. West, losing a hard-fought supermatch to Irakli by a score of 3-2. All of these matches were glorious masterclasses to behold. Each one deserves an in-depth analysis in their own right. The next month, on February 25th, Brzenk would have his toughest test to date, a match at King of the Table 6th against super heavyweight Denis Saplinkov, the former world #1, who had not had a match in 4 years due to health issues. Despite the time off, Saplinkov did not look like he had lost as much of his strength, defeating Brzenk by almost an effortless 6-0 score. On August 12, 2023, Brzenk would lose 3-0 to Todd Hutchings at the AWC Reloaded event. John was seemingly mortal, and perhaps it's the aged mortality that caused people to forget the decades that had come before. In many of these online debates, people look to the recent years of John Brzenk's performance and often forget how many decades have come before and all the history that comes with them. On September 23, 2023, John Brzenk would remind us once again as he would go against Alexei Vovoda at King of the Table 8. This was a rematch of the historic first match in 2004, which Vovoda won. Circumstances were different this time, as Vovoda had not competed in years and was not as dominant as he was back then. John would win this match 4-2. This brings us to the most recent match of John's career as of the time of filming. John Brzenk versus Sasho Andreev, East vs. West, a 97-kilogram world title match, which John had cut significant weight for. And it was in this match, in this moment, as we look back, we can ask ourselves, why is this moment so important? Why is it that when John loses, everyone remembers the ovation he receives more than the title win of his opponent? Because there is more to John Brzenk than just wins and losses, stats, longevity, or titles. When it comes to John, there is the most true essence of greatness. Conclusion: what is greatness? So what makes someone great? What makes someone the GOAT? Is it wins, achievements, dominance, longevity, or is it something more? John had all of this. He beat giants, went the distance, and has been doing so for decades. There is no debate in arm wrestling about who is the GOAT. There is just a huge mountain between him and whoever wants to try for second place. I would argue what makes John the GOAT is the fact that he had something more, something intangible. John's greatness is like the statue of Theagenes, where a legacy is so insurmountable that those who attempt to topple it are ultimately crushed in their pursuits. And even when it came to the losses, the memory of the man stood taller than his short list of shortcomings. So why did John do what he did? Well, he started because of his dad. What kept him motivated? John says, quote, "You just start to have something to do. It is a hobby for most, like weightlifting. It's a little more complicated than that, and it's obviously not UFC fighting, but it requires some camaraderie between arm wrestlers and other people. You just kind of get hooked into the whole group. I think the most fun part is climbing the ladder and stepping through the competition." Thank you very much for listening to this production. I spent a great deal of time studying, researching, and editing. I really hope you enjoyed and learned something about the greatest arm wrestler of all time, John Brzenk. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the video with your friends. Thank you all for listening.